Today is Wednesday, December 24th, 2025, and the time right now is 11:17 a.m. here in Ariquemes, Rondônia, Brazil. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Today's segment is confrontational because it needs to be. There are reports circulating about the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, Michele Singer Reiner, and whether every detail in the early reporting holds up or not. What did happen next is the point of this episode. The presidential response, immediate, public, and political, turned a moment that demanded restraint into a moment of spectacle. So let me set the rules up front. This is not a celebration of anyone's death. This is not about owning the libs, and this is not about grading a president on vibes. This is about judgment, because leaders, real leaders, know when to speak and when to shut up. In this episode, I'm going to lay out why that response was reckless, why timing matters, and why even people on Trump's side should be able to say, yeah, no, not that. If you find this useful, like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. Media, narratives, politics, crime, courts, whatever you want covered. If you want my long-form, research-driven work, my books are listed on my Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong page. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go. Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go.
This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. It's Tuesday, December 16th, 2025, and we need to talk about a response that was reckless, unnecessary, and beneath the office. And unlike the left, we aren't celebrating a brutal murder such as in the Charlie Kirk murder, and I will call out Trump when I believe he has crossed a line. The response to the reported murders of Rob Reiner and his wife Michele Singer Reiner, let's be absolutely clear from the start, this is not about politics or policy, this is about judgment. According to multiple reports, the morning after the Reiners were found dead in their Los Angeles home, President Trump went on social media, and instead of restraint, instead of empathy, instead of saying nothing, he blamed their deaths on what he called Trump derangement syndrome. He labeled Rob Reiner a deranged person and said he was very bad for our country. Then he doubled down. This is not leadership. This is impulse with a megaphone. And no amount of spin changes it. This wasn't weeks later. This wasn't after facts were established. This was immediately in the raw aftermath of a violent tragedy. That timing matters, because moments like that separate adults from provocateurs. I don't want to hear about free speech. I don't want to hear about fighting back. And I definitely don't want to hear about he's just being Trump. Presidents don't get graded on vibes. They get graded on restraint. That's why the backlash was immediate, not just from Democrats, from Republicans, from conservatives, from people who normally defend him, because even they recognize this crossed the line. When your own side starts wincing, you didn't own anyone, you screwed up. Here's the real failure. He couldn't separate personal grievance from human death. That's not toughness, that's a lack of control. Yes, Rob Reiner was a harsh critic. Yes, Trump has been attacked for years. None of that matters here, because murder or alleged murder is not a debate stage. It's a moment for silence. Let me say this plainly. If you can't stop yourself from turning tragedy into political theater, you're not leading. You are reacting. The reported deaths of Rob Reiner and Michele Singer Reiner deserved dignity. What they got instead was spectacle. And calling that out isn't partisan. It's basic standards. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Today is Wednesday, December 17th, 2025, and the time right now is 11:02 a.m. here in my studio. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud, and we're covering the Reiner murders, what's confirmed, what's alleged, and what still isn't known. Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michele Singer Reiner, 70, were found dead in their Los Angeles area home over the weekend. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, was arrested the same day. several hours after the bodies were discovered. Prosecutors announced formal charges this week. Nick Reiner has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors have filed special circumstances allegations connected to the multiple murders and the use of a knife, details that can increase sentencing exposure if he's convicted. The district attorney has said the potential penalty could be life without parole, and that pursuing the death penalty is a decision still under consideration. Multiple outlets report there was a heated argument involving Nick and his father at a holiday party the night before the killings, but authorities have not publicly stated a motive. Reuters reports Nick Reiner has previously spoken about addiction struggles and periods of homelessness. Nick Reiner remains jailed without bail, and initial court proceedings have been impacted by medical clearance issues. According to reporting cited by Reuters and AP coverage, investigators say evidence collected at the scene helped link him to the crime, but detailed forensic specifics have not been fully laid out publicly in a complete evidentiary narrative at this stage. At this point, these are charges. Nick Reiner is the defendant, and guilt must be proven in court. The motive is still not publicly established by investigators. Rob Reiner was a major figure in film and TV, known as a director and performer. Michele Singer Reiner was a photographer and producer and was described in coverage as an LGBTQ+ advocate. If you want more of my long-form research-driven work, my books are listed here. Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong start with Bloodstained Banner, Dismantling the Republic and the American Left from Liberalism to Despotism. If you've got questions you want covered, crime, courts, media, narratives, or anything current, send them in during the week. I'll pull the best ones into upcoming segments. Today is Sunday, December 21st, 2025, and the time right now is 9:10 p.m. here in Eric Ames, Hedonia, Brazil. This is Sean Armstrong thinking out loud. This video is the perfect snapshot of the difference between an American public school graduation and a Brazilian police-run military school graduation. In the United States, public school graduations usually look like this. Caps and gowns, a line of students, a handshake, a diploma, and you're out. Look what you're seeing here. These students are in uniform, they're wearing red berets, they're grouped in position like a cohesive unit, and they're taking a formal group photo as part of the ceremony, like it's an official moment in an institutional tradition. That's because this school isn't just a school, it's run by the Brazilian police. So the graduation isn't only academic recognition, it's also a public display of discipline, protocol, and institutional identity. Now look at the setting. This isn't a high school gym with folding chairs. It's a full event hall, stage truss lighting, a formal stage area, and big floral arrangements built to make this feel like a serious milestone. And that's what separates the two models. American public school graduation celebrates academic completion. Brazilian police-run military school graduation celebrate academic completion plus discipline culture, visibly, publicly, and formally. And yes, this is personal for me because my stepdaughter, Hinata, earned her moment in this kind of environment. If you want my books and my projects from Super Gringo Books, use my main book list page, Books by Super Gringo Books.
Senhoras e senhores, autoridades civis e militares, corpo docente, instrutores, servidores, familiares e principalmente os formandos do terceiro ano do ensino médio do CTPM3 de Ariquemes. Hoje nos reunimos em um momento solene, carregado de significado. É fundamental compreender que este diploma não representa um ponto final. Pelo contrário, ele simboliza uma vírgula na trajetória de vocês. O aprendizado é uma constante e a evolução deve permanecer constante. O mundo que os espera, exige preparo, caráter firme, inteligência emocional e capacidade de adaptação. Quem para de aprender, fica para trás. Quem busca evoluir, lidera. Levando consigo
pelo respeito e pela dedicação de ensinamentos adquiridos no CTPM3, nos acompanhe em todos os caminhos que escolherem trilhar. Beatriz Felicer, Yasmin Nicole, Anne Caroline, Luana Nunes e Jennifer da Silva. Vamos receber agora o grupo 14. Vem pra cá, Evelyn Rodrigues, Silmara Rodrigues, Helena Mon...
Senhoras e senhores, autoridades civis e militares, corpo docente, instrutores, servidores, familiares e principalmente os formandos do terceiro ano do ensino médio do CTPM3 de Ariquemes. Hoje nos reunimos em um momento solene, carregado de significado. Esta formatura não é apenas a conclusão de uma etapa escolar, é o encerramento de um ciclo construído com esforço, disciplina e perseverança, e ao mesmo tempo o início de uma nova missão na vida de cada um de vocês. Ao longo dessa caminhada, vocês aprenderam que no ambiente militar, hierarquia e disciplina não limitam, elas orientam. São pilares que ensinam respeito, responsabilidade e senso de coletividade. Cada ordem cumprida, cada rotina seguida, cada desafio superado, contribui para formar não apenas estudantes, mas cidadãos conscientes de seus deveres e de seu papel na sociedade. Aqui no CTPM3, vocês foram treinados para entender que resultados não nascem do improviso, mas da constância, do comprometimento diário e da busca permanente pela excelência. Aprenderam que vencer Vencer não é nunca cair, mas levantar-se com mais força, com mais maturidade e mais sabedoria. Reconhecemos hoje o empenho de cada aluno que honrou o uniforme, respeitou seus superiores, apoiou seus pares e nunca perdeu de vista o valor do estudo. O mérito que celebramos nesta solenidade não é apenas acadêmico, é moral, ético e humano. É fundamental compreender que este diploma não representa um ponto final. Pelo contrário, ele simboliza uma vírgula na trajetória de vocês. O aprendizado é uma constante e a evolução deve permanecer constante. O mundo que os espera exige preparo, caráter firme, inteligência emocional e capacidade de adaptação. Quem para de aprender fica para trás. Quem busca evoluir lidera. Levando consigo os valores adquiridos nessa instituição, lembre-se sempre do nosso grado, que resume aquilo que se constrói todos os dias no CTPM3. Forjados com caráter e inteligência. CTPM3, Educação por Excelência. Sigam firmes, com coragem para enfrentar os desafios, humildade para continuar aprendendo e disciplina para manter o rumo. Onde quer que estejam, sejam exemplo, sejam referência e sejam motivo de orgulho. Encerro esta formatura reafirmando a convicção que norteia nossa missão educacional e militar. Educar com disciplina, formar com caráter e conduzir com honra, porque quem aprende sobre princípios militares marcha preparado para vencer a vida. Quero desejar a todos um excelente restante de noite. Vamos proceder agora para o último ato como alunos do CTPM3.
Parabenizamos os alunos formados por concluírem essa etapa marcada pela disciplina, pelo respeito e pela dedicação. Que os ensinamentos adquiridos do CTPM3 os acompanhem em todos os caminhos que escolherem trilhar. Estão oficialmente formados. Agora são designados veteranos do Colégio Defendants da Polícia Militar Unidade 3. Nesse momento, o jantar está liberado. Nós temos o buffet do lado direito, do lado...
Today is Monday, December 22nd, 2025, and the time right now is 10:55 a.m. here in Araquemes, Rondônia, Brazil. This is Sean thinking out loud. Let's walk through this comment exchange because it's a perfect example of how people confuse anecdotes, causality, and peer review. Step 1, everybody leads with personal stories. One person says, I don't know people who died from COVID, not the vaccines. Another one says, the only ones I know died after getting the vaccine. That's the first problem. Personal experience is emotionally powerful, but it is not a data set. It doesn't establish cause. It doesn't control for age, comorbidities, timing, or diagnosis. Step 2, somebody makes a medical claim with zero proof. Then another commenter says, it's sad you don't want to look at the facts. Your heart is now damaged. That's not a fact. That's a diagnosis from a stranger on the internet. If you're going to claim someone has heart damage, you need actual clinical evidence, period. Step 3, the Italy argument. Then Carol Sanders 9376 says those symptoms were linked to COVID-19 in Italy before any vaccine was available. Yes, myocarditis existed before vaccines, but that does not logically mean vaccines can also be associated with myocarditis. That argument fails basic logic. Two things can be true at the same time. Myocarditis can happen after COVID-19 infection. Myocarditis can also rarely happen after vaccination, especially in adolescent young adult males, shortly after certain doses. The CDC explicitly states myocarditis, pericarditis have been rarely observed after vaccination and supports a causal association with vaccines. And large studies and meta-analysis repeatedly find that myocarditis risk is higher after SARS-CoV-2 infection than after vaccination overall, while still noting important age-sex product nuances. So Italy had it before vaccines is not a rebuttal, it's a dodge. Step 4, the peer review complaint. Then at Carol Sanders 9376 pivots to fake journals and vanity publishers are the problem. Yes, predatory publishing exists. That's real. COPE has guidance in predatory publishing and the warning signs, lack of transparency, deceptive practices, and so on. But here's the issue. Saying fake journals exist doesn't invalidate high-quality evidence from major medical journals, national monitoring systems, and large population studies. It's not a get-out-of-evidence-free card. Step 5, what I said and why it matters. When at Carol Sanders 9376 tries to dismiss the argument with the Italy line, the correct response is myocarditis existed before vaccines, COVID infections can be associated with myocarditis, and vaccination can be associated with myocarditis in a rare subset, especially young males, while the overall risk picture often still favors vaccination. If you can't hold two facts at once, you're not debating science, you're doing team sports. And since this is Carol Sanders 9376, I have a graduate degree in counterterrorism with a specialty in Islamic jihad. I'm trained to separate signal from narrative. It's like trying to explain capitalism to a monkey. Now, important note, I'm not diagnosing anyone. I'm not giving medical advice. If someone has chest pain, shortness of breath, palpitations, or fainting, talk to a clinician. Quick plug, if you want my books and projects from Super Gringo Books, use my main book list page, Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong. Send questions during the week. Send me questions during the week like do you think people rely too much on anecdotes instead of data? What would count as good evidence to you? CDC monitoring, big population studies, or something else? Should people be able to admit infection risk and rare vaccine side effect risk in the same sentence? Today is Monday, December 22nd, 2025, and the time is 4:05 p.m. Welcome to Sean Thinking Out Loud. If you find this analysis helpful, like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments. And send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and answer them in upcoming segments. If you want my books and research in one place, use my Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong list page, Academic Writings from Sean Armstrong. Is Trump really fixing the economy? He just went to Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, and told people costs are coming down and that Democrats are to blame for high prices. So let's do a clean reality check. Inflation trends, what prices are actually doing, and why housing is still crushing young buyers. One important note before we start, the latest inflation report has major data caveats because the government shutdown disrupted data collection. That matters. Trump's message in North Carolina was basically, I inherited a mess, I'm fixing it, prices are dropping, and Democrats caused the pain. Now, politically, that's a simple pitch. But economically, we have to separate three things. 1, inflation rates slowing. 2, prices actually falling. 3, households feeling relief. Those are not the same thing. The most recent CPI reading shows inflation at 2.7% year over year in November 2025. But here's the catch. Economists in multiple outlets warn the CPI data may be distorted because the shutdown interrupted normal data collection and even disrupted October's report. So yes, 2.7% is the headline, but the confidence level is not what it normally would be. Now, on specific prices. Egg prices are a good example of some things really did drop. Reuters reported egg prices plunged more than 13% in November. That's real relief in one category, but it doesn't mean the overall cost of living suddenly got easier, especially when people are still getting hit by housing, insurance, utilities, and other basics. Housing is still the monster in the room. The National Association of Realtors reports the share of first-time home buyers fell to a record low of 21%, and the median age rose to 40. That is not normal. That is not healthy. That is a flashing red warning light. And the affordability squeeze is exactly why a lot of younger people hear inflation is down and think, cool story, why can't I buy a house? Even when inflation cools, housing can stay brutal because supply is tight and financing costs matter. One proposed solution floating around is reducing or eliminating capital gains taxes on primary home sales, arguing it would reduce lock-in and get more homes on the market. Trump has publicly discussed the idea of eliminating capital gains tax on home sales to boost housing supply. Here's the mechanics in plain language. Right now, there's a federal exclusion up to $250,000 in gains for single filers and $500,000 for married couples on the sale of a primary residence. But because home prices have risen so much over time, more sellers can exceed these thresholds, which can discourage moving. So the argument is, if you reduce that tax burden, more people sell, inventory rises, and prices cool. Some commentators, like Stephen Moore, explicitly argue that eliminating the capital gains tax on primary home sales would free millions to sell and increase supply. Important reality check. Even if this increases supply, it's not a magic wand. Housing affordability is also shaped by zoning, building costs, interest rates, regional job markets, and household formation. On inflation, experts are cautious because the shutdown affected the CPI process and makes comparisons trickier than usual. On prices, Trump can point to categories that fell, like eggs, while critics point out many households still feel squeezed and don't experience rapidly falling prices in everyday life. On housing, the data shows first-time buyers are getting crushed, and that's the most visible reason people don't feel economic wins. So here's the clean summary. 1. Inflation in the latest report is 2.7% year over year, but the shutdown created data distortions that warrant caution. 2. Some prices did fall. Eggs dropped sharply, but that didn't automatically translate into broad relief. 3. Housing affordability remains the biggest pressure point, especially for younger Americans and first-time buyers. 4. The no capital gains tax on home sales idea could increase listings, but it's only one piece of a bigger supply and cost puzzle. Now, I want your input. Question of the week. What matters more to you right now, lower inflation or lower housing costs? And if you could pick one policy to fix housing affordability, what would it be? Drop your answers. Send in your questions during the week. I'll cover the best ones next. And again, my books and research are listed on my Super Gringo Books catalog page.
Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today emerges from a really deep consideration of the evolution of civil rights enforcement here in the United States, specifically focusing on that pivotal period right after the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right. And the foundational promise of the Reconstruction Amendments was, of course, equal citizenship. But, well, history showed that turning that constitutional ideal into an actual operational reality required a lot more than just putting words on paper.
Exactly. So the central question we're really examining here is this. Did the post-1964 shift, moving enforcement from only prohibiting discriminatory intent, the classic demand for equal treatment, toward using group-based statistical metrics and outcome management, did that represent a necessary completion of the Civil Rights Project?
Or was it an inversion of its core principle of equal individual citizenship?
And I'm going to argue that this shift was a necessary institutional measure, a pragmatic evolution required to make equality, as they said at the time, a fact and a result.
And I'll be arguing that this shift actually inverted that original logic, that while enforcement was obviously necessary, transforming equal citizenship into a system focused on permanent group classification well, it fundamentally compromised the principle of universal law.
So my position is essentially this. The hard reality is that the original civil rights ideal failed in practice for nearly a century. Judicial mandates, even something as landmark as Brown v. Board, they just lacked the institutional machinery to dismantle a region-wide caste system, a system defended by hostile local officials, private actors, you name it. The shift toward outcome-based enforcement, it wasn't an inversion, it was a necessary pragmatic recognition that simple opportunity is not enough when you're facing that kind of deeply embedded structural resistance. We see this necessity in the very design of the '64 Act. Statutes like Title VI, which conditions federal funding, and Title VII for employment, they required measurable compliance tools. And why? To reach not just, explicit bigotry, but the subtle discrimination, the systemic failures that masked intent. The goal became, and this is the key phrase, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. I think the crucial takeaway here is that an outcome failure isn't just bad luck. It's a diagnostic sign. Outcomes have to be policed because their failure is often proof that institutional systems are still operating as a caste filter, no matter what the stated policy is.
I absolutely recognize the power of that historical argument, especially regarding Jim Crow evasion. But my concern is whether solving that procedural problem required us to fundamentally sacrifice the universal law ideal. I just don't buy that the means justify the profound conceptual transformation that we saw. The original civil rights vision, rooted in Reconstruction, it sought to remove race from the machinery of law entirely, to treat citizens as individuals under universal rules. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, for example, it was aimed at securing basic rights for individuals, not establishing proportional outcomes for groups.
Sure.
So the shift to outcome management, it fundamentally changes the moral and legal unit of concern from the individual citizen to the group category. And this focus on disparity is the primary evidence of wrongdoing. It necessitates constant category accounting, auditing, monitoring by race, by sex, and that risks creating what I call a permanent system of managed group status. This displaces the principle of equal treatment with a system that measures its own legitimacy by proportional results. And ultimately, that becomes incompatible with the framework of constitutional republicanism, which really presumes governance by general law and restrains the state's power to classify in the first place.
Okay, so let's start with that operational necessity. Formal legal neutrality, it just failed. It utterly failed to solve the structural gap between declaring a promise and actually making that promise govern daily life. I mean, the historical reality of Jim Crow and all the adaptive evasion strategies that followed, it proves that hostile local institutions just nullified rights through procedural obstruction and selective non-enforcement. We know this from the collapse of Reconstruction. Constitutional rights can be defeated in practice when local actors simply refuse to offer protection and accountability. So outcome metrics, they provided the administrable proxy that federal agencies needed to identify system-wide failures and compelled change. It achieved what case-by-case litigation, based on intent alone, simply couldn't do. For instance, without a tool like Title VI's funding leverage, conditioning federal money on compliance, local power would have just continued to treat equality as optional. That was a critical workaround, especially since the 14th Amendment was often judicially constrained by the state action doctrine. So if you rely only on individual intent, how do you possibly litigate against a sprawling, sophisticated system designed specifically to hide that intent?
I agree that Title VI created necessary leverage at the time, but framing that bureaucratic expansion as a necessary institutional completion, I think it overlooks some very severe institutional costs. Relying on federal money as leverage, it shifts power away from transparent lawmaking and toward what you could call bureaucratic governance. Agencies expand the meaning of non-discrimination through, frankly, opaque regulations, enforcement guidance, compliance audits. And this introduces a conceptual drift that I think you have to acknowledge.
Okay, what does that drift look like to you?
Well, the focus changes from prohibiting wrongful differential treatment, which is what discrimination is, right? Treating one person worse than another based on a protected trait, to addressing unlawful disparity, where unequal results are themselves presumed to be the constitutional wrong. And once the goal becomes managing statistical outcomes, the enforcement system structurally incentivizes race-conscious decision-making.
As a liability shield, you mean?
Exactly, as a liability avoidance strategy. Institutions start asking, how do we make our numbers match the population, instead of asking, are we treating every single applicant equally? And this converts civil rights from a matter of constitutional restraint into an issue of regulatory jurisdiction, often determined by these elastic readings of commerce or funding power rather than core constitutional principles.
But that move was necessary precisely because the pre-1964 model relied on proving specific intent, which became virtually impossible to show when exclusion moved from explicit laws to subtle patterns and procedural games. You can't enforce anti-caste principles if the system provides plausible deniability for every structural failure. We are talking about institutions that were never colorblind in their operation, even if the laws governing them became facially neutral. The anti-caste tradition requires that the law secure equal public standing, not just provide equal language on a piece of paper. If we had insisted on policing only explicit intent, the Jim Crow hierarchy would have just adapted its methods and survived.
And yet, in avoiding that one evil, we introduced another risk. The state is now required to reintroduce race as the organizing principle for its administration. And this is my second point, the threat to universalism. When compliance is measured by group performance in areas like employment or voting, the system structurally trains citizens and the people who manage those systems to think in blocks. The result is that civil rights, which were intended as a shield against discrimination for individuals, a way to assert your rights without reference to group membership, they transform into an administrative politics of categories and permanent group adjudication.
But isn't that just remedial?
Well, it fundamentally undermines the universalist premise that equal citizenship shouldn't require you to be a member of a protected bloc to be recognized. The law is supposed to move us away from racial governance. Managing statistical outcomes forces us to manage group status permanently. The framework becomes one of permanent caste management, but in a new direction, where legitimacy is tied to fulfilling proportional outcomes, not guaranteeing equal rules. I mean, how is that system sustainable for the long-term health of a republic that's built on individual rights?
I'd argue the necessity of classification is merely remedial, because the pre-existing structural inequality was imposed by race. I think we need to look at voting rights again to really get this, because it's a perfect example of an anti-subversion rule. The 15th Amendment failed historically because determined actors could suppress political participation without using explicit racial language. Simply having formal access to the ballot box was meaningless if electoral structures, like at-large elections or skillful gerrymandering, ensured a racial group's votes were politically ineffective.
Right.
So the shift to policing vote dilution, measuring the ability to elect, it's not about a group entitlement to proportionality. It is an anti-subversion rule. It prevents democratic institutions from being used to preserve a racial caste in political power under the guise of neutrality. It checks the power of the majority to nullify the political voice of minority through procedural manipulation. If we prohibit looking at outcomes and using classification to measure effectiveness, we permit Jim Crow's systemic legacy, those subtle patterns in districting or employment standards, to persist. We are simply leaving equal protection as a principle without any practical application. What's your alternative for that kind of systemic exclusion?
I appreciate that the voting rights example highlights the problem of procedural manipulation, but it also, I think, perfectly illustrates the inversion I'm talking about. The law now treats electoral systems as a production system whose legitimacy is judged by its yield for a particular group, rather than exclusively by the fairness of the universal rules applied to all citizens. The shift of concern there is just unmistakable, and that concern brings us to the third and, in my view, the most serious consequence, the erosion of procedural safeguards which are essential to the rule of law. And this is my third point. When enforcement expands from explicit discrimination to subtle patterns and statistical disparity becomes the principal evidence of wrongdoing, the system effectively replaces the presumption of innocence with the presumption of prejudice. Unequal results are statistically correlated with bias, and the administrative machine treats that correlation as accountability.
But isn't that just a necessary move to acknowledge that institutions due to historical inertia, often carry forward practices that disproportionately harm certain groups, even without any present discriminatory intent? Why should we privilege a procedural presumption of innocence for an institution over the lived experience of systemic exclusion?
Because once disparity is the trigger for investigation, it structurally forces institutions and individuals to continually justify every single decision in demographic terms to avoid suspicion. This is where the policing of internal states begins. When a hiring committee produces numbers that are statistically unequal, the administrative burden shifts. The committee is implicitly presumed to have acted with bias unless they can prove a neutral necessity for their results. This environment allows vague accusations, things rooted in cultural offense, or even poorly defined concepts like microaggressions, to become actionable complaints under the banner of creating a hostile environment that leads to disparity. So, the enforcement system converts civil rights from a check on definable external conduct into a punitive managerial culture focused on policing viewpoint, language, and internal states. The moment you start regulating speech to manage a statistical outcome, you've completely left the anti-caste tradition. You've entered an administrative regime that substitutes due process for demographic compliance.
See, that's where I just can't get on board. The historical presumption of innocence often functioned as a literal shield for systems of domination. We need to remember the Reconstruction era, where local police and courts maintained the veneer of legality while selectively enforcing rules and tolerating private violence. Jim Crow's core wasn't just explicit statutes, it was those local legal habits that treated racial hierarchy as the baseline of order. The anti-caste tradition requires constraints on how power is exercised, not just blind adherence to procedural formality. Where a system tolerates private violence, excludes testimony, or applies rules selectively, the failure is institutional. The shift toward policing patterns is an attempt to enforce the state's obligation to provide actual protection, the true meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. We have to be willing to accept that the moral vocabulary of rights can evolve to meet structural resistance, even if it requires challenging traditional notions of intent.
I acknowledge the history, but the solution to procedural abuse in the past is not the abandonment of robust due process now. When disparity is the sole trigger, accountability shifts fundamentally from conduct to condition. The individual decision maker, the manager, the educator, is treated not as a moral agent accountable for their choices, but as a likely carrier of systemic bias, whose every decision must be processed through an administrative apparatus focused on managing demographics. That is an ethic of managed dependency, not of equal citizenship, and it severely threatens the rule of law principles essential to a republic. Furthermore, relying on administrative agencies to define and police these subtle patterns, it gives immense unchecked power to the bureaucracy to reshape institutional standards outside of the democratic process. And that's the final cost. We trade constitutional clarity for regulatory elasticity.
That trade-off, however, was required to ensure the constitutional clarity of equal citizenship was realized in daily life. You cannot have rule of law without equal protection, and you cannot have equal protection if the operational systems of society are designed or even just permitted to sustain a caste system under a mask of procedural neutrality. The modern enforcement regime is designed to ensure that the procedural veneer doesn't once again hollow out the substantive guarantee. So, our exchange, I think, confirms the profound tension at the heart of the modern civil rights regime. To make the constitutional promise real, federal power had to build an enforcement system powerful enough to overcome local resistance and inherited structural disadvantage. This meant moving beyond merely prohibiting explicit intent and adopting methods like Title VI's funding conditions and statistical monitoring that could compel equal results and deliver equality as a lived condition. The cost of failing to manage those outcomes would have been the persistence of the caste system that Jim Crow rebuilt, hidden behind a mask of formerly neutral rules, and that would have fatally undermined the foundational promise of equal citizenship.
And I think that's where we still diverge, fundamentally. While I acknowledge the historical necessity of powerful enforcement tools, I maintain that the methods we ultimately adopted risk becoming the very thing they were designed to replace, a system where status is allocated and managed by race. By adopting statistical disparity as the measure of justice, the anti-discrimination state risks sacrificing the Republican ideal of equal citizenship under universal law for a continuous, permanent administrative project of category management. So the listener, I think, must weigh whether the undeniable practical gains achieved by this pivot justify the profound conceptual cost of transforming civil rights from a command against racial classification into a demand for classification. And there is much more to explore in the material regarding the long-term institutional costs of this administrative turn.
Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025, and the time right now is 8:22 a.m. in my time zone. This is Sean, thinking out loud. If you've got questions you want me to cover during the week, drop them in the comments. I'll grab a few and turn them into segments. And if you want my books in one place, use my Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong list page. Let me tell you what I've noticed on social media. There's a pattern. The people bashing MAGA nonstop and the socialists and communists screaming, "Workers, rise up!" always seems to be posting the hardest during the work week in the middle of the morning, Monday, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., and they're posting memes about how much they hate you, how much they hate America, and how the workers should rise up. And I'm sitting here thinking, if you're not at work on a Monday morning, why exactly are you the person I'm supposed to take life advice from? Because here's a simple rule. If you want to understand success, stop studying failures. Stop listening to failures. Stop modeling failures. Stop letting failures teach you how to live. Study people who have worked, built a life, learned something, produced something. And yes, success is subjective. For me, I consider myself a success because I write books to educate people. I put in the time, I did the research, I wrote them well. Now, if you don't read them, that's not my fault. You can even buy the books just to refute them. Fine, but you can't argue against the content if you haven't read it. And you know what the loony left does? They still try. Your book is crap. Meanwhile, I'm looking at the math and thinking, if you don't even understand how royalties work, you probably shouldn't be lecturing anyone about economics, labor, or workers rising up. And let's address the Workers Rise Up crowd directly. In Bloodstained Banner, I wrote, "State ownership of resources and central planning are hallmarks of socialism." Translation, the Rise Up fantasy always ends with the same thing: more control, more bureaucracy, fewer opportunities, and a boot on somebody's neck. And the loudest cheerleaders for that system are almost always the people who can't run their own lives, so they want a system that makes everybody else as stuck as they are. Here's the takeaway. If someone is online every weekday morning acting like a professional victim, professional outrage addict, and a professional failure, maybe don't let them be your model for success. Go study builders, people who have created something, people who have worked, people who have improved. And again, success is subjective, but posting revolutionary memes at 9:30 a.m. on a Monday is not a resume. Send me questions during the week. Who do you think people should be studying if they want to improve their lives? What's your definition of success? And what's the biggest sign someone is a failure influencer? Drop it in the comments. Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025, and the time right now is 8:51 a.m. in my time zone. This is Sean thinking out loud. Here's a question I keep coming back to. Does anyone actually believe the loony left cares what's in the Epstein files unless it's something they can use to hit Trump? Because that's the real filter. If a document drop doesn't give them a clean, headline-friendly Trump did X crime on Y date, they're not interested. Not because they're careful, not because they're principled, because it doesn't serve the narrative they already decided on. And that's the point. Most of these people aren't reading. They're reacting. They're not investigating. They're consuming a prepackaged conclusion and calling it critical thinking. So no, heavy redactions, missing context, and messy releases won't suddenly create an intellectual honesty. If the files don't say what they want, they'll dismiss them. If the files hint at someone else, they'll scream conspiracy. If the files are incomplete, they'll pretend that only one specific interpretation is possible because it's the only interpretation that helps their team. And here's the question that should bother any adult. If you only believe evidence when it flatters your politics, do you actually care about victims, or do you just care about ammunition? Because justice doesn't work like fandom. If you want my books and research, use my Books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong's list page. And send questions during the week. What would it take for partisan people to accept evidence that doesn't help their side? Do you think the public even want the truth anymore, or just a win? And what's the best way to demand transparency without turning victims into content? Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025, and the time right now is 9:18 a.m. in my time zone. This is Sean thinking out loud. Send in your questions during the week. I'll pick a few and turn them into segments. And if you want the full list of my books, use my Super Gringo Books catalog page. I just read a post making the rounds that says, basically, this is Trump's immigration machine. America is outsourcing brutality. CBS yanked a 60-minute report about CCOT, and that proves the U.S. owns whatever happens in that prison. Let's slow down and separate what's confirmed and what's alleged and what's being spun. Yes, CBS pulled a planned 60-minute segment called Inside CCOT hours before broadcast, saying it needed additional reporting. The correspondent, Sharon Alphonse, reportedly described the decision internally as political, while CBS leadership said it was an editorial readiness issue. And versions of the segment did leak online through international distribution streaming. So this got pulled. Part is real. There are serious allegations that appear in reported testimony from deportees and rights groups, and they are being described in the leaked reporting, but that's not the same thing as court-adjudicated findings. Multiple outlets summarize the segment as featuring detainees describing harsh and abusive treatment inside CCOT. A leaked clip circulating online includes detainees' claims of repeated beatings and punishment confinement. If someone wants to argue America is torturing people, the adult standard is independent verification, documentation, legal process, accountability, not just vibes and viral clips. That's not dismissing allegations, that's demanding they be handled like something that matters. There is documented reporting that some deportees, families, and lawyers dispute the gang allegations and say they were flagged on weak indicators like tattoos. Reuters reported on Andres Guillermo Morales, a Colombian Venezuelan migrant whose wife says he was no gang ties. Reuters says verified his U.S. work permit connected to his asylum process and found no Colombian criminal record. Other reporting describes tattoo-based suspicion being used broadly in these deportation cases. That doesn't prove every person was wrongly sent, but it does support the claim that mistakes and weak predicates are plausible risk in the system being described. Here's the part that actually matters. If you're serious about justice, a federal judge ruled the government must provide a way for Venezuelan migrants sent to CCOT to challenge what happened, either through court process or by returning them so they can pursue claims. That's not a meme. That's the legal system saying you don't get to skip the basic steps. So if someone wants to talk accountability, start there. Who was sent? Under what authority? What evidence was used? What appeal process existed? What safeguards prevented error? And what happens when the government gets it wrong? If you really care about human rights and victims, why are you turning it into a partisan monologue? Because the way you win credibility is not by yelling gulag and demanding your neighbors be shamed into agreement. The way you win credibility is by insisting on transparent criteria, documented evidence, meaningful hearings, and consequences when standards are violated. That's not left or right. That's civilization. What should the minimum due process standard be before the U.S. transfers a migrant to foreign megaprison? Drop your answer in the comments and send in questions during the week. Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025, and the time right now is 9:55 a.m. in my time zone. This is Sean thinking out loud. If you've got questions you want me to cover during the week, drop them in the comments. I'll grab a few and turn them into segments. Now, quick announcement. I've launched my new site, Academic Writings from Sean Armstrong. This is the home base for my long-form work, my writing, my research, and my projects, organized so you can actually find things without digging through social media chaos. What you'll find there. On the About page, I lay out exactly who I am and why I write the way I write. I'm a retired U.S. Army veteran, combat tested in places like Ramadi in Afghanistan, and later trained in law, intelligence, and counterterrorism. After leaving active service, I earned a graduate degree in counterterrorism with a focus on Islamic Jihad and built a second career as a writer, instructor, and independent publisher through Super Gringo Books. And I write research-based work on the American left, capitalism and socialism, foreign policy and modern culture, plus practical books on martial arts and American English for Brazilian learners. Where to start? If you want the simplest entry point, start with my book catalog page, books by Super Gringo Books and Sean Armstrong. That page is the master list, so when I reference a title in a segment, you can go straight to it. Why I built it? Because I'm tired of people arguing from memes and headlines. The site is for people who want the full context, the source material, the reasoning, the receipts, and the deeper explanations that don't fit in a comment section. Questions of the week. What do you want more of on this site? More essays, more podcast segments, more course materials, more Q&A posts. Drop your answers in the comments and send your questions during the week. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Sean Armstrong here. I want to talk about something you see constantly online. People using confident nonsense as a substitute for evidence. And I'm going to use one specific exchange with Carol Sanders 9376 as the example because it's a perfect demonstration of how misinformation spreads. Here's the pattern. First, the opening claim. Let the conspiracy theorists win their Darwin Awards. The only people I know died from COVID, not the vaccines. Okay, that's a personal anecdote. And anecdotes are not data. You can always find someone who knows a guy that supports whatever they already believe. Public health doesn't work on, I know a guy. It works on surveillance data, clinical studies, and reproducible findings. Then the next claim gets more specific. COVID can kill you up to 18 months after you have it, even if you have no symptoms. That's not a serious statement. That's a vague, sweeping claim designed to sound scientific without actually being accountable to anything measurable. Here's what's true, and here's what's being twisted. Yes, post-COVID conditions can last months, sometimes longer. That's real. But the blanket line, COVID can kill you up to 18 months later, even if you were asymptomatic, is not a responsibly stated fact. It's a rhetorical grenade meant to shut down discussion. If you want to talk about timelines, you have to talk about who you're talking about. People who are hospitalized, high risk, older, or young and healthy. Those are not the same group. Now here's the next move they tried, and it's a classic. They say myocarditis was linked to COVID in Italy before any vaccine was available. You did know that, right? Yes, and that still doesn't prove what they think it proves, because this is basic logic. The fact that myocarditis existed before vaccines does not mean vaccines can also be associated with myocarditis in some cases. Both things can be true at once. Myocarditis after COVID infection is real, and myocarditis after a vaccination is rare, but also real. This is exactly why serious sources don't speak in absolutes the way social media debaters do. They quantify risk, they compare risk, they separate infection risk from vaccine risk. Then they pivot because they don't want to argue evidence. They want to discredit the concept of evidence. So they say peer review is real, but fake journals and vanity publishers are the problem. Translation, I don't have a rebuttal, so I'm going to wave my hands and imply the entire system is corrupt. Yes, predatory journals exist. Everybody serious already knows that. But that's not a rebuttal unless you can do three things specifically. 1, name the article you're attacking. 2, name the journal. 3, explain what's wrong with the methods, the data, or the conclusions. If you can't do that, then you're not critiquing science, you're just hiding behind cynicism. Then comes my favorite part of the exchange. Yes, I have been peer-reviewed. Okay, great. Where? What journal? What publication? What paper? What citations? Because peer-reviewed doesn't mean your buddies liked your comment thread. It means your work was submitted, evaluated, and published in a venue where others can read it and challenge it. And that's the theme of this whole segment. At Carol Sanders 9376 isn't actually arguing facts. They're doing performance confidence statements, vague timelines, and credibility theater. Now I'm going to be very clear. I'm not telling you what to think about vaccines. I'm telling you how to recognize dishonest argument tactics. Anecdote pretending to be evidence. Overbroad claims with no measurable definition. Logic errors dressed up as gotchas. Attacking peer review in general instead of addressing the evidence. Credential posturing with no citations. And by the way, this is exactly why I wrote long-form work in the first place. I do not do trust me, bro. I do receipts. If you want my full breakdown in myocarditis, mRNA vaccines, incidence rates, and risk-benefit context, go read my write-up on my site. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to be serious enough to read the arguments before you try to refute it. And if you're going to tell me I'm wrong, fine, but earn it. Bring citations, bring data, bring methodology, not internet swagger. Quick reminder, I have a graduate's degree in counterterrorism with a specialty in Islamic jihad. I'm trained to separate signal from narrative, and a lot of people online are drowning in narrative. All right, if you want to keep up with my articles, books, and the podcast, go to my site and follow along. And as always, send me questions during the week. If it's a good question, I'll turn it into an episode. Like, subscribe, share, do the basics. And if you're going to argue online, stop arguing like a politician and start arguing like an adult. Today is Tuesday, December 23rd, 2025, and it's 11:05 a.m. here in Arequipa, Brazil. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud. Let's talk about something most people never learn until they get burned by it, legal ethics. Because in the Tyler Robinson case, the man charged in the killing of Charlie Kirk, the defense isn't just fighting the facts, they're fighting the prosecutors. And that's not a drama move, that's a strategy move. Here's the issue in plain English. The defense has filed a motion asking the judge to ban the entire Utah County Attorney's Office from prosecuting the case. Why would they try that? Because the defense claims there's a conflict that a prosecutor had a personal connection to someone who was at the event where the shooting happened, and that information and messages were allegedly shared before any proper ethical screen was set up. Now, let me slow that down. An ethical wall, an ethical screen, is basically the legal version of keep this person away from this case and keep the information away from them. Because prosecutors are supposed to be disinterested, not emotionally invested, not personally connected, not tied to a witness or a victim in a way that makes the public go, wait, is this fair? And in a case where prosecutors have signaled they may seek the death penalty, the court is going to take the appearance of fairness issue seriously. Now, to be clear, a motion like this is an allegation, it's not a ruling, and it's not proof. The Utah County Attorney's Office has said it disagrees and plans to formally oppose the motion in court. So what happens next? The judge looks at a few big questions. 1. Was there actually a conflict? 2. Was an ethical screen needed, and was it set up in time? 3. Did anything improper happen, or is this just the defense doing defense things? 4. Even if nothing improper happened, does it still look bad enough that the court needs to step in? Because that last part matters more than people want to admit. A justice system doesn't survive on, trust me bro, it survives on procedures people can look at and say, okay, that was clean. And that's the real lesson. High-profile cases are not just about guilt or innocence, they're about whether the process is so solid that even the losing side can't credibly claim it was rigged. So here's my question for you. If you were the judge, what would you require to feel confident the prosecution is clean? A written ethical screen, different attorneys, a different office, outside counsel, a special prosecutor? Because your answer tells me whether you understand the difference between justice and winning. If you want more of my writing and research, you can find it at my site supergringo.wordpress.com, and in my books, I write to educate. If someone refuses to read, that's not a research problem, that's a choice. Send me your questions for the next episode. I'll break them down point by point. All right, let's talk about the Epstein file releases and the part that made everyone's antennas go up. The redactions and the fact that a batch of documents briefly disappeared from the DOJ website. Here's the basic timeline in plain English. The Department of Justice started publishing a large online set of Jeffrey Epstein-related materials under a new federal requirement to release the records in phases. In the most recent round of releases, people noticed two things. 1, a lot of pages have heavy redactions. 2, 16 items briefly vanished from the DOJ's public database and then showed up back up later. So the obvious question is, why redact and why take anything down at all? Redactions are not automatically a cover-up. Sometimes they're a legal requirement. In a case like Epstein's, redactions typically protect victims' identities and privacy, especially when victims may have been minors at the time. Federal law explicitly recognizes crime victims' rights, including dignity and privacy, legal information, witness names and identifying details that could expose or endanger people, ongoing investigative threads or law enforcement techniques, what investigators know, how they know it, and who they're looking at. Grand jury secrecy. Grand jury material is protected under Rule 6, and DOJ attorneys and others are restricted from disclosing matters occurring before the grand jury. In other words, even if the public wants everything, DOJ can't just dump names and addresses and testimony into the open internet without consequences. This is where it gets interesting. According to reporting on the incident, the DOJ acknowledged the database included highly sensitive material and warned that some documents contained claims that were untrue or sensationalist, including allegations submitted to the FBI ahead of the 2020 election, claims the DOJ said were unfounded and false. Then 16 items were temporarily removed and later restored after review. That pattern, remove, review, restore, fits a pretty normal explanation. A document goes up, someone flags a redaction problem, privacy issues, or an unverified allegation being displayed improperly. DOJ pulls it to recheck, redactions, and labeling, then reposts it when it's corrected. That's not proof of innocence, guilt, or they're hiding the truth. It's proof the DOJ knows the public is watching, and they don't want to be the agency that doxes a victim or publishes garbage allegations as if they were facts. If a name appears in release files, that does not automatically mean criminal wrongdoing. Even the reporting around this release cycle emphasized that some claims circulating in the documents were described by DOJ as unfounded. So here's the responsible takeaway. Presence in documents equals relevance to an investigation or the record. Presence in documents does not equal proof of a crime. If you want accountability, you should want two things at the same time. Real transparency, real standards for evidence. Because if you accept anything in a file as automatically true, you're not chasing truth, you're chasing a story. So, why did DOJ redact temporarily pulled documents? Because Epstein's case is a legal minefield, victim privacy, grand jury restrictions, and the risk of publishing unverified allegations as though they're established fact. And the fact they restored the items after review suggests quality control, whether you trust their motives or not. If you want to keep this honest, demand receipts, demand the underlying sourcing, demand court filings, sworn testimony, and verified records, not vibes, not screenshots, not somebody said. That shows you how you separate the truth from the circus. Let's close this out clearly. If the facts change, I'll adjust. That's what adults do. But the standard I'm defending today does not change. When a violent tragedy is fresh, when families haven't even buried their dead, a president does not need to treat it like a clapback opportunity. That isn't strength, that's impulse. And if your defense is he's just being Trump, what you're really saying is he can't control himself and we've decided that's fine. I'm not fine with it. And you shouldn't be either, no matter who you voted for. Now I want your input. What should the standard be for public officials in the first 24 hours after a tragedy? Silence? A basic condolence statement? No speculation? Where's the line? Drop your answer in the comments and send in questions during the week. I'll pull the best ones into upcoming segments. I'm Sean Armstrong. This is Sean Thinking Out Loud.
Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let it flow. Thinking out loud, let's see where we go. Welcome to the noise in my head, where ideas spark like lightning threads. No script, no map, just let